All right, we're trying again, seeing if we can get the live stream working. Checking for audio again. We have crazy amount of trouble with audio. I'm not sure why. Can you hear me out there? All right. Today we're talking about product ownership. I enjoy talking about product ownership because it makes a huge difference in the effectiveness of a team. If you've got 7, 9, maybe 20 people across a couple teams looking to a product owner for direction, that work is really important. If the product owner can point that team towards a real impact, can provide good slices of value, can help them build understanding and connection with the customer, that's going to be a motivated and effective team. If you don't have those things, if you have a backlog that looks like a lot of backlogs I see, where you have components and tasks pretending to be user stories, you have lots of things that seem to be foundational and infrastructure kinds of things, delaying real value, then you have a team that is busy perhaps, but not having the kind of impact on the world that they could. And that can be discouraging. And it's ultimately just ineffective. It's waste. So I like working with product owners in a variety of ways. And today I want to tell you about a new resource I've created, a Backlog Makeover Guide. I'm going to answer some questions that I've had from a variety of product owners and people who work with them this week, in person, on Facebook, on Twitter. And then I'm going to announce who's getting free registration to my 80/20 product ownership online course, which teaches some, what I consider the key skills for an effective Scrum team. So let's get into it. First off, the Backlog Makeover Guide. Starting today, you go to agileforall.com/backlog-makeover, agileforall.com/backlog-makeover. You will find a guide that I created to help you over the next 2 weeks. You have an exercise every day, some simple tasks, improve your backlog, get your team aligned around value, get them focused on things that matter, and build some new skills and habits that you can keep using on your backlog after the first couple weeks. So I notice we can talk about all these big things like releases and forecasting and team structure and things like that. And those topics are fine, and we'll actually get to some of them later this morning. But there's so much low-hanging fruit in most backlogs. There are things you can do at the top of your backlog that will have an immediate impact on your team. And they're not really that hard. It's just that most product owners don't know what to do or don't know how to do it. And so this Backlog Makeover Guide is just one day at a time. Here's a tweak you can make to improve your backlog, and here's why it works. And then tomorrow, here's another one. So I encourage you to get over to our website and download that and start taking advantage of it, and let me know how it works for you. So into today's questions. Yeah, I've got a bunch of them this time. Let's talk about backlog grooming, or backlog refinement, if you like. So David asks, how do you recommend keeping product owners motivated to groom the backlog daily or on a regular schedule and continually prioritize product backlog items? And a related question that I got in my CSPO class this week is, how do we make our backlog grooming meetings work better? People don't seem to really enjoy those. We're not getting a lot of value out of it. So my answer to both those things is actually the same. I don't believe most teams need a backlog grooming meeting. In fact, the way I put it sometimes is you need a backlog grooming meeting like you need a programming meeting, which is to say you don't. In the same way that on a software team, programming is part of the work, and people who do it collaborate with other people to get the information they need to do it, working on the backlog is just the work for the product owner, or it's a part of the work anyway. And to do that effectively, they need to collaborate with other people. And most of that collaboration doesn't require the whole team, and really probably shouldn't happen in the same 2 or 3 hour block. It's something that can happen a little bit at a time with different smaller groups. So for example, say you have a big user story coming up to the top of your backlog, and you know you need to break that down. Maybe because it's been estimated, or maybe it just clearly seems bigger than everything else you've done. You don't really need the whole team to do that. So I would recommend product owners show up to the daily scrum. The daily scrum is about the team collaborating to figure out how they're going to make today matter. Like, what's today's plan? And the product owner is part of that team. So you show up to the daily scrum and you say to the team, one of the things I need to accomplish today that requires your help is breaking down this big story into good small stories. I could do it on my own, but I probably won't end up with a good even split because I don't understand, like you do, what makes it big. So who's the right person or people to help me, and what's a good time to do this? And then the team self-organizes around it and builds it into their plan for the day. And then maybe you go spend 20 minutes working on that and then you're done, but it was 20 focused minutes instead of these painful multi-hour meetings where everybody's in the same room. If you're looking further down the backlog and you're saying, hey, we want to think about roadmap and features and some of those things, again, you probably don't need the whole team to work on particular parts of that. So I think, in David's question about keeping product owners motivated to do this work, I think one of the things that's demotivating is the feeling that it doesn't matter, or the feeling that there's so much of it we can't be good at it. So by keeping it focused to just the right detail at the right time and doing it in small batches so that you see results, I think that's inherently motivating. And it's just, I need to have the right information going into this next planning session or this next meeting with my stakeholders. And so I look at the backlog and I work on that. In my CSPO classes and in the 80/20 product ownership online course, I teach a kind of Kanban structure for the backlog where there's a limited amount of items at different levels of detail. So stories only out this far, features out this far, themes and options for your strategy going out this far. And every day for a product owner then just looks like go to the right side of the board where things are closest to done and see what you need to do to collaborate with the team to refine items. When that column's done, you move one to the left. You look at the next one. And you look at the next one. And when there's white space, you fill it. And that helps structure the daily backlog grooming, because you don't have to do everything. You just do the highest priority thing that needs your attention. And you keep doing that until you run out of time. And then tomorrow you do the highest priority thing that needs your attention. And you keep doing that until you run out of time. And so the job of the product owner ends up actually looking a lot like the job of a developer or tester, some other role on a team, where you're always just looking at what's the next most important thing to do, and you're working on it until you're done, and then you work on the next thing. The other thing that may be going on when a product owner seems to be demotivated and not really into working on the backlog is that the backlog is full of things that don't have clear business impact. Right? We're motivated when we have the sense of relatedness or purpose, when our work is connected to something larger. So if you have a backlog that is full of things that are not interesting, like maybe it's just a collection of random requests from lots of stakeholders, or maybe it's a bunch of more technical items, I don't blame the product owner for not being motivated to work on that stuff. But when your backlog is something that traces all the way from a big business impact you want to have on people, on the world, down into focused high-value features, down into user stories that make the system increasingly more feature-filled for users towards that big vision, that's motivating to work with. And so the symptom of demotivation probably has a root cause of some problems with the backlog itself. And well, the backlog makeover guide is designed to help with that at the top of the backlog, and 80/20 product ownership is designed to help with that with the bigger items. So, a lot of my clients have been able to resolve those issues by using those resources, and might check it out. Jeremy asks, what tips do you have for helping product owners find the balance between too much detail in the product backlog item and development teams not feeling they have enough input on the solution versus not enough detail and development teams not having any idea where to start? A few things there. First off, the product owner really is responsible for bringing the who and the why to the table, and the what kind of falls out of that. So if you're a product owner struggling with this balance, the place I would start is to say, do we have a clear understanding of who the customer is? And are we aligned around that on our team? That's going to help with decision making. And do we have a clear understanding of the need, the pain, the problem that we're trying to solve? And then when we get into the what, the kinds of things that show up in user stories, we should be able to trace that back to the who and the why that we have a shared understanding around. And then we can have conversations around what details do we need to answer. Now, some user stories are more complex than others. Some are more of what Kevin might call complicated, where the product owner can do some analysis and break down the details and say, here's how this works. And it's reasonable in that case for the team to expect a decent amount of detail. When you have a complex item where there's a lot of questions about it, where there's some uncertainty that may only be resolved when you get into it, then it's a matter of getting enough information to be able to start, but not trying to have all the information to be able to finish. And so I love that Jeremy asked about the team knowing where to start, because that's what I look for, is do we have enough information to know where we're going to begin? And in one of the lessons in the Backlog Makeover guide, I talk about finding the core of each story. What is the one thing in there that gives the story its meaning and that all the variations hang off of, and generally going there first. And that helps with this having somewhere to start. You go after that core, then you look at what variations do we need to support around the core. And if you can describe some of those in advance. If you can't, they emerge and it's fine. And so again, I've tried to answer questions like this or at least the root causes of them in that Backlog Makeover guide. The other thing is I like to have teams emerge information on backlog items when they need to answer questions or make a decision. So you think about when a story is first created, the immediate decision you're faced with is, where does this go in the backlog? So you need to have whatever conversations you need to have, generate the information you need to generate to be able to answer that question. And then you don't need any more information at that point. Next, maybe you're looking at sizing it to see if it's appropriately sized. So you're going to the team and asking for an estimate, perhaps, asking them to compare it to other items. That's going to raise some more questions, which you're going to need to discuss and get answers to and capture. And then you can stop creating detail. So you're not going to make too much, just enough to make the decision. And then maybe you need to split that big item into small items. That's going to create some more detail. So you talk about that, you write down what you talk about, and you stop. And so at every level, as an item is moving up the backlog, we're generating more information as sort of a pull system from a need for information, instead of just putting in all the detail we can think of and hoping it's the right detail. And there's a cognitive bias that gets people in trouble sometimes around this, where our brains are not great at telling the difference between accuracy and precision. So if something is really precise or really detailed, it tells our brains that it must be really accurate, but it might not be. It might just have a large number of guesses or some really precise numbers in it. And one of the benefits of emerging data and collecting it just when you need it is that you avoid tricking the reader of this item or the viewer of this item into thinking that more is settled than actually is. So I would have just enough to be a placeholder for the next conversation, have the conversation, make the decision, capture that information, and then wait until you need to generate more information. And that resolves a lot of that tension between too much or not enough. It's just enough to do the next thing, whatever the next thing is. And I would be really careful in sprint planning, or whatever your equivalent is, to remember that the next thing is starting, not finishing. We need enough information to start. We don't necessarily need, nor can we always create at that point, enough information to finish. So there may still be some open questions, and that's okay as long as product owner and the rest of the team collaborate closely together. Okay, here's a fun one that I got in an in-person conversation this week with a group of product owners. And they said, our leaders keep committing to scope and dates for big things. So they'll say, this summer, we are going to deliver these features in this product, and even announce that to other stakeholders. And they weren't the only ones to tell me this. I hear this from product owners all the time. And so their question was, so what do we do? It seems like the Agile approach would be to let a lot of these backlog items emerge, and some things turn out to be bigger than expected, and some things are smaller than expected, and so you can't really plan that far out. So they wanted to know what to do. So there's the ideal state would be, of course, making your planning match. So if we're talking about how do we communicate with stakeholders about big things, that should probably be consistent with how we work on small things. And ultimately, that's where you want to get in an organization. Like, you communicate around business impacts you're going to go for in a quarter, but you don't communicate about specific features and user stories. Or you even just say, we're going to release something every month, and it's going to be the most valuable thing we know about, but we're not going to even communicate in advance what those things are going to be. Those approaches leave you a lot of room for learning and dealing with complexity in your work. But let's say you're in a situation where you're on a team that's trying to work in an Agile way, trying to respond to change and learning, and you're in a larger organization that really doesn't work that way. And they're used to making big plans and commitments and roadmap for the year and things like that. It turns out that the next step for a product owner is actually the same either way. It's get the top of your backlog in order, make sure you're focusing on the most important things, and do them well with your team. And then just keep grooming the backlog as things come up. Because if you're shooting for delivering the most valuable thing you could at the end of the quarter and not committing to it, or someone has committed a bunch of things for the end of the quarter, either way, your actual capacity to deliver on your team is exactly the same. Somebody saying it must be done doesn't make it possible. Even though we see this dynamic in movies and TV shows all the time. I love watching for this, where there's some situation that really is impossible and they don't have the capability to solve it. And it's like there's no way we can beat this opposing army or something. And then some character, maybe the king or something, says, but we must. And then suddenly it's like, oh, okay, we can do it now. And then they go do it. And that's what planning looks like in so many organizations. It's like, here are these 30 things we need to have done in the space of 10. And somebody maybe speaks up and says, we can do 10. We can't do 30. And then the executive says, but we must. And then everybody goes away and like, okay, it must be possible now. Declaring that it has to happen doesn't change your capacity, which means product owners approach the situation the same either way, which is make sure your team is doing the most valuable thing they could be doing. Always. Drive out the waste. Focus on the core value of every little thing you do. And maybe you focus well enough that you actually do get more done and you meet that crazy goal, or maybe it goes like it usually goes and reality is what it is and you don't meet that crazy goal. But at the time that you don't meet it, the thing that wasn't done was the lowest priority thing. Instead of behaving as if you're going to meet the goal just because somebody said you had to, and not doing the items in really true priority order, and then something important falls off the bottom. Just always work on the most important thing, always slice it and focus in on the core, and you end up managing your risk, whether you have unreasonable deadlines and goals around you or not. And that should reduce the stress for product owners, because you know that the riskiest thing is the least important thing, because you've moved the most important thing to the top. Now, there's a skill around this, on figuring out how you can do something early that delivers a lot of value. And sometimes people are used to working on lots of what feels like foundational things that have to happen first, dependencies that have to happen. And the really valuable stuff gets put off later after those dependencies. I can tell you, after working with many dozens of teams in these situations, that there's pretty much always a way to get early value. It's just probably different than you're used to working. And the technique I created for this, what I call feature mining, is a way to take a big idea and find that valuable first slice. I've taught it at conferences. It's in my 80/20 product ownership course. It's in my CSPO course. And it works reliably over and over again. So if you're not able to do that, it's not because it's impossible, like 99% chance. It's because you just don't know how yet. And you can relatively quickly. Frank on Twitter asks, any tips for improving the flow of information and feedback from product management and business owners post PIP, which I learned stands for program increment something. I don't know, it's a safe thing, which I don't do. And as I read about that, the gist of it seemed to be large chunks that we deliver over many sprints and many teams. How do we improve the flow of information and feedback after we ship those large chunks? So I'm going to give maybe a controversial answer here, which is I would be willing to bet if you're not getting the feedback you want, assuming flow of information here means we're not getting information back to the team, or to the product owner. A lot of times when I see product owners complaining that they're not getting the feedback they want, it's because the thing they're delivering isn't actually interesting to the people they want feedback from. Maybe because it's too big and it's taking too long to get feedback. Maybe because it's one of these what feels like a foundational piece and doesn't actually deliver the value they care about. So what I find is that if you get good at the slicing, you do practices like feature mining and go straight to the core value of what you're talking about, people give you feedback because you've given them the thing that they care about the most and they want to use it. And even, I think back to a couple of years ago when I was on the stakeholder side of the Agile for All website redesign and rebranding kind of project. And I mean, I've been a product owner, I teach product owners, I've been a developer. I know the importance of feedback during development. The company that we were working with that claimed to be Agile and turned out not to be in any meaningful sense, they wanted to get feedback from me. And even knowing the importance of that, I found it very hard to get motivated to provide feedback because the things they were showing me that they wanted feedback on were some of the least interesting things in the project. They deferred the high value stuff until the very end, and actually a lot of it fell off after we ran out of budget, and basically did the opposite of what I'm recommending here. If you start with the highest value thing, the thing people want the most that will make the biggest difference, they're going to want to see it and they're going to want to give you feedback on it. So I think not getting enough feedback or getting too much feedback in a way that's unwieldy, I think is actually a symptom of not structuring the backlog well and not having small increments with really high impact, and then just one after another through those. So I would look at how do we slice this to focus in on the core impact better so that we shorten the feedback loop and get smaller batches of feedback, and so that we're showing people things they actually want to interact with and give us feedback about. And this is one of the reasons I'm not a fan so much of things like SAFe that tend to aggregate large amounts of work and turn the feedback cycles into larger chunks. And there are other things I have issues with, but that's one that affects product ownership directly. My preference would be smaller teams or smaller groups of teams working on really highly focused backlogs with good value, and teams interacting with each other as a network of teams rather than a hierarchy of teams. And that improves a lot of these things around feedback and value and cycle time and lots of things there. Let me see what other questions are coming in here. All right, so I've got one here about, essentially we're distributed, product owners in one place, business analysts in another place, developers in another place, maybe lots of time zones in between. So this is a hard situation for a product owner because your feedback loops are longer. Especially if, let's say you're the product owner here in Denver and you're working with a development team over in India, 12-hour time difference, you will struggle to get the quick back and forth that you'd like as a product owner, where you might bring a backlog item to the team, they raise some questions, you answer the questions, that creates new questions. So in this case, I think you're particularly at risk for the accuracy versus precision problem I mentioned earlier, where if you provide too much information, it's going to keep people from asking questions. And so I would look to set up a way of collaborating with whatever tools you use for that, where you try to avoid providing too much information too early that will keep conversations from happening, and you let information be pulled as decisions need to be made. And it's going to be relatively slower than it would be with an in-person team, but it's going to prevent that illusion of certainty where you think you're aligned and then your developers go off in a different direction. And now you effectively have a really long feedback loop and a really expensive one as you build the wrong thing. So remember, a team costs thousands of dollars every day. And so you want to resolve a lot of these things in cheaper ways than going out and building something for a sprint or worse yet, 2 sprints, and discovering that it was the wrong thing. I'm looking at some other potential questions here. Let's see. I get a lot of stuff about making backlog grooming less painful. A little bit at a time, do it continuously. I don't think I can preach that one enough. Just start at the top of your backlog, just a little bit every day. So get that backlog grooming guide and start using it on your backlog, or backlog makeover guide rather, and start using it. And I think you'll see that it becomes more natural to groom your backlog day by day rather than batching that up, because you're only looking at a small number of items at a time and making them better. So last thing before we wrap up, the free registration to 80/20 product ownership. I was going to get all the names together and do one of these, but I had 3 really good questions on Facebook and Twitter. So David, Jeremy, and Frank, I am going to give each of you a free registration in 80/20 product ownership. So I will reach out to you on Facebook and Twitter and figure out how we can make that happen. But I appreciate the engagement. I appreciate the questions that gave me a lot to talk about. And I would love for all of you to get a chance to learn more about things like feature mining and how to structure the backlog. And hope you see an impact on your teams right away from that. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Check out the Backlog Makeover Guide. And we'll see you next week on Agile for All's next Friday live stream.